We've moved this conference to a lot of different locations, and this year we're out at the Botanical Garden, and I think that was sort of the signal for the gods to call forth this amount of rain so you wouldn't be able to walk through the beautiful botanical gardens. Emily has a copy of the handout up for today's talk, and there's no need really to take any notes. And I'm proud to be one of the few males on the program or in the room. It's nice that we have a little bit of diversity here in terms of genders. What I'm going to talk about is nutrition and the environment, which is a very hot topic, as many of you appreciate. My background is in nutrition, medicine, and public health, and it's really talking about alternative proteins today. And one might think about it as alternative lifestyles. It's not a screed against meat, but in fact we'll be talking about a diet that's good for the planet, good for the person as well. So I'm happy to respond to your questions. You can reach me through any of those contact things that are in the handout. Over the years, I've done a lot of thinking about nutrition and medicine, a lot of fruit and vegetable promotion. And one of my friends who started out as a physician and then became a graphic artist, Don Stewart, who's in town, drew this fruit and vegetable caduceus for me. I actually have that hat. I didn't bring it with me today. But we're really thinking about pulses, and initially I thought a lot about arterial pulses, but more recently about legumes, etc. So your feedback, if you give that, it might be that I'm like a longhorn cow, a point here and a point there and a lot of bull in between, and that may be your perspective. So the 2 points to make are that plant-based burgers, the Beyond Burger, the Impossible Burger, are baby steps on the right path. And that ultimately we need policies, public and private partners, and incentives are required. Some of you have seen that, for instance, the front of the label, packaging, regulations on sugar in schools. In Chile, which has the highest rate of obesity in the world, has reduced the consumption, even over an 18-month period, of sugar-sweetened beverages by 28%. So you really do need policies beyond just relying on soft interventions like health education. We're going to take a look at the whole here, and this is the famous poem basically about feeling diverse parts of the elephant, whereas one investigator sees it as a snake, another sees it as a wall, another sees it as a tree, or the gastroenterologist, like I am, sees the elephant as warm and mushy here. I think the key is to enjoy food, stay sane, sated, and safe, and I think the point that Dr. King made so nicely is that food and nutrition is not a biochemical study. It's not even a clinical study, simply. We always think about health, food and diseases, etc. We think about food and population. But the point that she makes is something that we all appreciate, is food is an emotional experience. And until you deal with people's emotions, and until you reduce some of the chaos and confusion and crises in their life, you're wasting your time, essentially just giving a simple nutrition instruction and thinking that that's going to stick. And I think Dr. King made that very well. This is an outline of this is what the bull will be about. We're on a collision course between demography, that is the growth in population, and climate change that make our current diet unsustainable for 2050. You all will be here at that point. I obviously will not be. The case for change is that meat has an adverse impact on health and on the people and on the planet. We need a change, that is a diet designed for healthy people on the planet. For those of you who are not nutritionists, I'll give you a brief mention about amino acids and dietary protein, because that's really what the focus is. We're going to talk about the cafe, where many of you go to, where food technology has reformatted burgers, the consumer, that is food culture and concerns, the clash that's going on about whether we should label these products meat or not, that's the food fight of farmers versus food technologists. The collapse, and that is that there are going to be even additional disruptive innovations in terms of microbes and insects for our future food. And then the challenge, which is really the ultimate one, which is how to change consumer choices. And in conclusion, we'll take your questions and answers and discussion. And if it were the evening, we'd be thinking about wind down time, but I don't think we're going to be doing that this morning. Given you a series of references, a lot of them are fairly recent. Most prominent was published in The Lancet about a year ago, which is called Food in the Anthropocene. And it's a commission that brought together prominent experts in nutrition and planetary health to develop this diet we'll review with you. So America's cattle ranchers are fighting back against what they're calling fake meat. And so we do have these dueling burger flippers, whether they be the farmer, that is the livestock raiser, producer, and then the food technologist. So what's the main problem in a simple statement? Well, you see these two lightning bolts coming together on the planet. That is the demographic change in terms of population and climate change. And simply stated, our current food system and diet no doubt cause poor health and ecosystem degradation, and thereby they compel changes for sustainability and public health. Importantly, what the Lancet did was bring together planetary boundaries, that is, what will a planet be able to sustain for environmental insults, and then also what are the health boundaries, and that's all tied together by the food system. So the global food system must operate within these boundaries, that is, for the planet and for human health and food production, to ensure healthy diets and sustainable food systems when we go from our current 7.5 billion people globally to about 10 billion people by 2050. And so there are various forecasts and estimates, but in fact, most likely by the time we're at 2050, we'll have between 9.5 billion people on the earth. Now, what food production must change, and that is it must increase to match the additional sort of 25% more people, or 30% more people, by 25 to almost 70%, depending on which particular food group you're talking about. And importantly, everybody in the world wants to eat more meat. That is, that there's increasing food and global demands for livestock to emulate the diet that we've been eating in the U.S. So in the old Walt Kelly book here and cartoon, he says, we have met the enemy and he is us. It's not external to us, it's us, particularly here in the U.S. So I think it's time to wake up and see what's around the corner. So here, coming around the corner is Merv's manure is hitting Sam's fans. So this is really the feces hitting the fan. What's the case for change? Well, meat consumption adversely affects the health of people and the planet. Let's review that in a little bit of detail. The food system is very complex, as many of you appreciate. Production depends on the social environment, the physical environment of land and water, and then has impacts on the larger environment of atmosphere, weather, and climate. Obviously, you need that for the production of plants. What goes into, and that production then involves the supply, and the supply goes out to producers and packagers and all the foods that we see in the supermarkets. And then what people eat depends on availability, affordability, and then our choices. And that has an impact on our health, our well-being. And that comes back and that influences demand. And so you have these many connections here when you think about the food system. There are bidirectional links, that means it goes both ways, and there are feedback loops, and that small changes then in this kind of system can have multiple effects. So diets are both the product and the driver of the food system. And their goals are really consumption of healthy diets and sustainable food production. Well, first of all, what's meat? We always think we know what meat is, but it's actually the flesh of a mammal, especially domesticated animals. We differentiate that from the muscle sources that we eat from fowl and fish. And there's a convergence now in Asia of Western diet consumption, which is incompatible with the change that we need. And here's in the bottom panel, you would see the, You see the changes that are in the global demand for meat. So right now there's 64 million metric tons produced of beef. Well, that's going to go up to 106, projected to go to 106 million tons. Similarly, there'll be a large change in poultry consumption, egg consumption, and pork consumption. Now, just to show you the changes that have happened since 1960 as one mark, and that's when I graduated from high school, to 2011. And this is really meat production, not just meat consumption, but there's some waste along the way. But we've gone up from 89 kilos per person to basically 120 kilos per person. So about a 30% or so increase. But what's really most prominent is what's happened in China. And this isn't about coronavirus or everything else you're reading about China. But since 1960, the population of China has essentially doubled to 1.3 billion people. We have about 325 million people currently, so they have about 4 times the population we have. But most importantly over that time, their consumption of meat, largely as pork, went from 4 kilos to about 60 kilos per person per year. So there's been a 15-fold increase per person in meat consumption in China, and given the doubling of the population, it's gone to basically a 32 times increase in meat consumption in China over the last 50 years. So you can see what that major impact has had, even though we're maybe eating just a little bit more meat and shifting to poultry, etc. China is major consumption of pork and just enormous changes as their economy improved over the last 50 years. So meat has a special place in human diets. And that's not to minimize its importance. There are innate preferences for meat as it's energy dense, as many of you appreciate, and it's nutrient and protein rich in terms of B12, zinc, iron, and of course a high quality protein. And we evolved in an environment where energy and protein were scarce, and so you can easily see why meat is considered important. Also, in some low-income countries, meat consumption provides a full and nutritious diet. There's no viable alternatives for a lot of low-income countries with foods with comparable energy and nutrient density. And livestock production is central to the economies. Now, importantly, diets have improved around the world. We've markedly reduced under age 5 mortality. And that's because we've made food much more convenient, available, affordable around the world, and there has been increased meat consumption, as I've shown you. However, these diets, particularly meat-based diets, are offset by global shifts to diets high in calories, heavily processed, and animal source foods and the associated environmental degradation. And you all know, as people interested in this kind of conference, that poor dietary quality is a major risk factor for chronic diseases, whether they be coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, colorectal cancer. And in fact, poor dietary quality it accounts for 40% of global mortality. So we're talking about major public health issues from our current consumption of poor quality diets. Importantly, on the other side, on the planetary side, agricultural food production emits 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, occupies 40% of the Earth's land, and that's because we grow all these crops not to feed us, but to feed animals. It causes nutrient pollution with the runoff from fertilizers, and it accounts also for a massive amount of fresh water withdrawals to grow these livestock that we do. Now just comparing, now not all muscle flesh sources are the same in terms of their environmental impact. Setting beef at 100% here for energy use, greenhouse gas emission, low land use, and water use, you see that pork in the gray bar there has a much smaller impact, about 60% of the impact on energy use, and about 30 or 40% of the water and land use. And poultry about the same as pork. And then they compare here cultured meat, which is really not a product at this point we'll come back to. But you can see that if you consume poultry, you're having less environmental impact than if you consume beef. Now, what will happen going forward to 2050 for a number of these? This is a complex chart, but really what it shows in the sort of salmon or pink-colored bar here, which is the meat area, that meat intake by 2050 is going to drive us past the environmental planetary boundary quite significantly for greenhouse gas emissions. And the same goes with cropland use. We just don't have the land, we don't have the arable land, and we can't continue to produce greenhouse gases and their impact on temperature, climate change, particularly increases in temperature. Importantly, right now we're already exceeding the planetary boundaries for nitrogen and phosphorus application, that is really chemical fertilizers, and it's only going to get worse. Now, of course, it is there, we're doing that to grow the plants that we feed to livestock particularly. Now let's relate, in this somewhat complex graphic, let's relate the risk of mortality to the average environmental impact. And you see foods, and we started this when I did a dietary approach to lowering cholesterol in children about 30 years ago. In terms of separating foods into WHOA, that is to slow down on, spelled W-H-O-A, you could spell it W-O-E, slow and go. Now in the WHOA category, both for environmental impact and risk of mortality, you see in that upper right-hand panel unprocessed red meat and processed red meat. So that's the bacon and ham of the world, and then the steaks and burgers that we eat. In a middle zone with really relatively low risk or same risk of mortality but still environmental impact, we see chicken, fish, and dairy. Now let's attend for a moment to what the vertical axis is. It's ranging actually there from 1 to 100. So it's not really quite a log scale, but it's a very dramatic expansion. So you see that unprocessed red meat might be at 100, whereas the green foods are down by about 2. So a 50-fold difference between them. And in the green go foods, we see legumes, olive oil, whole grains, potatoes, vegetables, fruits. And then there's one food that has really very little environmental impact, but has an increase in mortality, and that's sugar-sweetened beverages. So we're not suggesting more sugar-sweetened beverages. So you can see that the same group of foods that we generally recommend for healthy diets are also those that have low environmental impact. Now, what are the scientific targets then for healthy diets? And this is what the Commission put together. So it's really quite a change. This is a version of the plate, but the plate here reflects a major increase in fruits and vegetables. And that's, very different than our current intake. And then over on the red bar here, the red part of the pie, is what the diet will look like for really some of the protein sources. And what you see is that in that light lime green area of plant-based foods, which are legumes and nuts, they're vastly expanded. and the beef, lamb, poultry, eggs, and fish is much smaller. So it is a major change in the amount and the ratio of plant source protein to animal source protein. Let's get more quantitative. What it reflects is that almost all grain consumption is whole grain consumption. Importantly, the goal is to consume what would turn out to be about 5 servings of vegetables a day, and that's non-potato vegetables, and then about 3 to 4 servings of fruit a day. So really up there at about 9 servings of fruits and vegetables, not counting potatoes, which is a main source. And then seriously limiting beef so that essentially it would be a tablespoon or 14 grams of beef per day, which is really allowing yourself one 4-ounce portion of meat a week, and then chicken at about an ounce a day, so maybe 1 breast of chicken per week, but a massive increase in legumes and nuts. So this is the planetary diet. Now, how strange is this diet? I mean, it sounds very strange for right now, but it's worthwhile to, and I'll come up on that in a minute, but it's very similar actually to the Mediterranean diet that was consumed in the 1950s. Now, if you look at where we are already, we're vastly above this health and planetary boundary. For meat, we're actually about 6 times more meat. We're about 70% above for potatoes, same with eggs, and same with poultry. Now, importantly, we're eating very little fish compared to what's recommended, potentially, and we're eating very little fruits and vegetables, and hardly any nuts and legumes. Now, you've all heard about fruit and vegetable promotion. I've done it in schools for probably for 20 years. And even though we report that in a school we can change the kids' intakes, even when we observe them in the cafeteria, and we get good intake data also from parents about what they're eating, yes, in a program we can change it. And you all hear about farm to table, local, fresh and organic, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, all these places, right? Are we eating more fruits and vegetables as Americans? The answer is simply no. Disappointingly, our average annual non-potato intake is 52% excuse me, of the planetary recommendations, and there's been no change over the last 25 years. So all the talk, local, farm to table, organic, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods, may be having an impact on some of us, but to the American consumer has had no impact over the last 25 years. Disappointing, but that's the fact. Now, this global planetary diet is really like the Mediterranean diet. It's not like the Mediterranean people are eating right now. This goes back to the 7 countries study in the 1950s, when in fact in Crete and southern Italy, people were eating diets very low in red meat. It was an average of about an ounce a day. It was largely plant-based, and it was a high-fat diet based obviously in a lot of olive oil. If you've ever seen an olive tree, you're just struck by the incredible number of olives on there, and obviously why they consume so much olive oil. And the Greeks at that time had one of the longest life expectancies in the world. How effective would this diet be? Well, it will reduce deaths around the world by about 20%, which means that there'd be 11 million fewer adult deaths per year. And so the consumption of this healthier diet would also have a positive impact on our health. Let's review briefly proteins and amino acids. I mean, the word protein really comes from Greek meaning first, and so really it is sort of the first and foremost nutrient because it's so limiting in the diet. Many of you appreciate that we have 20 different amino acids. 9 are essential. That means that we can't make them in our body. We have to consume them from other sources. That protein, of course, is the major component of all cells. It's essential for growth and maintenance of body tissue. What's the RDA? A lot of people don't know. The RDA is actually set at what would meet the requirement. So it's not the required, it's the recommended. But it would meet the requirement of 98% of people. So it's already got this built-in fudge factor, as people in nutrition appreciate. How much is that? Well, it works out to be about 0.8 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. So for a 70 kilo, 154 pound adult, that would be 56 grams. And if you were consuming 2,000 calories, as is recommended, that would be about 11% of your daily energy intake. We're eating a lot more protein than that. We're already at above 16% of our calories coming from protein. So there's already a vast excess in most Western diets of protein. So if we cut back on protein, we're still way above the RDA. We could cut back by essentially 30 or 40%, and that's way above probably what the actual requirement is for protein. How do you get your essential amino acids? Well, you can eat it as a single food source. You can eat egg, for instance. Egg albumin, the white of the egg, is an excellent protein. So that's called a complete protein. Or you can do it with complementary proteins by combining beans and grain. Beans and other legumes are deficient in tryptophan and methionine. But those are rich in corn and other grains. Corn and other grains are deficient in lysine particularly, and so if you combine a bean and a grain, you have a complete protein, and that's the whole point of tortillas and beans, rice and beans, pasta and beans, etc., that are so common in diets around the world. Let's talk about some of the new foods that are out there, the innovative food technologies. You probably have all heard about the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat. And this is really some version of propagating plants for progress. Burgers are us. We eat 154 burgers per person per year. And so if you're not eating that many, then probably somebody else is eating twice as many as you're eating. I see somebody nodding her head over here. How many do you eat in a year? The lady in tan. Yes. All right, so somebody else has to eat 300 burgers a year to make up for it. But here this lady's at the wishing well saying, I wish to be irresistible to men. So what happens is she's converted into a burger. And we've even made iconic furniture. This is actually a chair, so it looks with tomato pillows and pickle, etc. So yeah, we hustle and rustle a lot of meat here. Okay, what's in the Impossible Burger? But I want you to look at the ingredient list. And as soon as you see that list, any of you know that's a highly processed food. And that's something to appreciate. This is not a healthy food for the individual, and I'll show you why. So it's highly processed. It uses soy protein concentrate, but to give it some meat flavor, it uses coconut oil, which of course is a major saturated fat. So there's a lot of saturated fat. To make it seem like a regular burger, they add a hell of a lot of salt. And then to make it bleed, they use soy leg hemoglobin, which I'll explain in just a minute. So what is soy leg hemoglobin? Well, most of you know the heme molecule. The heme molecule is, of course, why our blood is red, why our muscle is red typically, because it binds oxygen, carries oxygen to tissues when it's hemoglobin, binds oxygen in muscle that we use for energy. What the Impossible Burger people have done is isolate the soy version of hemoglobin. Because it's a legume, it's called leg hemoglobin. And it has chemical and structural similarities to hemoglobin, and it's red in color. So that's why the burger appears to bleed. Now, what they've done is they're not really isolating it from the soy nodule and putting that into the burger. They've taken that gene and expressed it in yeast, which is then the source. So it is a GMO product. There's some people who are concerned about GMO products. The other thing is that while it's halal and kosher, it's not really organic. And that while it is like heme, it's different than the hemoglobin in us, although it's been approved by the federal government, but it's not the same protein as hemoglobin. And heme is a potential carcinogen. It's one of the reasons why we think that meat is carcinogenic. Are Impossible Burgers healthier than beef? Well, the simple answer is no. First of all, if you compare it to the Impossible Whopper to the Whopper, you see that, and this is the full product, you see it's about $1 more, so about 20% more. Same calories, about 660, so one burger would be a third of your daily intake. Similarly rich in saturated fat, even higher in sodium than a regular burger or regular Whopper. So it's got 1,200 milligrams. If you're going to take in, 2,000 milligrams of sodium, you're really almost 60% of the way there. Let's talk about the Impossible Slider at White Castle. White Castle is a version. I lived a whole summer on White Castle, basically, in New Jersey growing up. And it costs $1 more, has some more calories, higher in fat, higher in saturated fat, and even higher in sodium. So there's nothing about it. So yesterday, as I was driving up from Auburn, passed a sign coming into Montgomery about the Impossible Crow Sandwich. And I just looked at the damn thing and I thought, oh my God, this is, the last thing that one should eat for breakfast. And you think you're doing some good, maybe for yourself or the planet, but maybe you're doing some good for the planet, but you're not doing any good for you. Impossible Foods has been very successful. They're now on menus, 300 different restaurants. They've opened a new plant to produce 1 million pounds of meat a month. And they're getting competition from major food companies like Tyson Food, Conagra, Nestle. So everybody's come up with a new title. There's the Impossible Burger, there's the Beyond Burger, and Nestle came up with the Awesome Burger. Like everything has to be maxed out. Let's look at the Beyond Burger. The Beyond Burger is slightly different than the Impossible Burger in that they use, rather than soy protein, they use a pea protein isolate. They also use coconut oil. And to make their burger bleed a little bit, they use beet juice. But similarly, it's high in saturated fat. They also advise you that since peas are legumes and some people are allergic to peanuts, that you should be cautious when introducing pea protein into your diet. Pea protein is very common. We've grown it for eons. It does require a lot less water. For instance, rather than to produce a pound of pea protein isolate, you need 43 gallons, whereas for pork, you need essentially 20 times as much to produce a pound of pork. Consumers are very familiar with legumes, and pea protein production has increased 70% to meet this demand. So here, Jack's and the beanstalk's father is telling him, well, they're not actually magic beans. They're just a heck of a lot better for you than meat or dairy. So I've sort of become a food rapper here, spelled W-R-A-P-P-E-R. But you all know the bean song, bean beans, the magical fruit, nitrogen nodules at its root. The more you eat, the better you feel, so let's have beans at every meal. So I did leave the toot out. Beyond Meat has jumped up in value once its IPO was released, and then by December it already collapsed. So in Texas we would say it's all hat and no cattle. So it's just people with limited things. So they've got NBA players endorsing it, and it sell Beyond Burgers as the new Gatorade, as a performance booster that tastes great. mean, it's hard for me to imagine how this burger is any more performance boosting than a regular burger. There's a product called Quorn, which sounds horrible, but in fact is very popular in the UK. It's a fungal derived product. It is actually in many ways much healthier than what is generally consumed in the US. But you will see Quorn, you'll see the Quorn, you'll see the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Burger in Whole Foods, for instance. And where are consumers right now? Well, consumers still need a lot of convincing. In a recent survey, about 40% of people in Canada or the US believe that a plant-based protein is associated with positive health effects. That's probably true if they really had formulated this the best way. Only about 1 in 6 people believes that plant-based protein offers superior nutritional value compared to animal protein. So I think the other 5 out of 6 are correct. There's no special value to a plant-based protein from a health point of view. Now, and only about 1 out of 7 believes that there's no need to eat meat in today's day and age. I mean, that's probably true. There's no need to eat meat. So on that, I would agree with that 1 in 7 people who said that. What do consumers want? Well, right now, we're in the midst of a high-protein drive. We've got the Paleo Diet, where we're all supposed to eat like a caveman. I always wonder what the caveman actually eat. I don't see them knocking down a big mastodon or, sort of one of these long-fanged sort of tigers or whatever. What I see them eating are insects and small rodents. That's actually what people were eating back then. But so 60% of Americans want more protein. 18% are trying to get more plant-based foods into their diet, but in the last 25 years they haven't been succeeding. 50% want to substitute plant-based proteins for animal proteins sometimes. And 14% of people use plant-based alternatives. They might use almond milk, veggie burgers, tofu. Importantly, the move towards the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger is not by vegans and vegetarians. It's by omnivores who are going to these restaurants and choosing that as an attempt to do something about the environment and something about their own health. As I said, I didn't think it was healthier, but it is a step in the right direction environmentally. What's the motivation of people? Well, people my age want to make healthier food choices. We still think it's going to make a difference when it probably wouldn't add 5 minutes to my life. But young people are interested in social, ethical, and environmental factors. But importantly, the first determinant is flavor, first and foremost. And the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger mirror the burger experience more than traditional veggie burgers, which are sort of beans and rice and sprouts all mixed together. It's red and it bled. That's what they can say about the burger. Consumers want to indulge while addressing personal and planetary health and animal welfare concerns. So you've got this going head to head. You've got this sort of plant-based cow on the left and a regular cow on the right. There's a fake meat war going on. So for every action, if you bring Newton's law to food, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Oops. I wanted to see how badly I was going to push us over time. The fake meat war. 25 states have attempted to pass legislation making it illegal for plant-based foods to be called meat. They don't want vegetarian food items called burgers, steaks, or hot dogs. And a representative from Arkansas said, I want my ribeye steak to have been walking around on 4 feet at one time or another. And a federal court blocked Arkansas's law, and this is being adjudicated in higher courts. But big meat, Tyson's, Conagra, Nestle, Hormel, are all now producing meat substitutes. So what are some disruptive innovations beyond these plant-based proteins that we've talked about? So kids are also interested in finances now, and it's saying, I learned about birds and bees in school. Now tell me about the bulls and the bears. So there is some interest. So to have a successful launch of a new food, it isn't enough to advertise for a novel protein food. There has to be good ingredient incorporation into foods, taste and nutrition, has to have an appropriate environmental impact, safety, and consumer trust. So there's a lot that goes into the launch of a food, and that's why right now, actually, agriculture has become the big place where investors are moving their money. I won't go through this, but we've talked about the fact that, so there are a lot of challenges to starting a startup. Now, what's our food future? I think the food future is really genetic modification of single-cell organisms grown in fermentation chambers and also insects, and I'll review that. Essentially, back to the 1960s, NASA, for their long-term space missions, showed some interest in a category of microbes, bacteria, that are called hydrogenotropes, that convert CO2 into food, just like plants do. And that those bacteria can produce an 80% protein ingredient if you culture these in fermentation chambers and you feed them CO2 and some nutrients. And it produces a pale brown powder with nutrient flavor that's obviously high in protein. Algae. Many of you know spirulina as one of the blue-green microalgae. You can grow these in photobioreactors, which is just a big glass tube that you shine some light in, throw some nutrients, some CO2, and they will double in volume over a 24-hour period. You harvest them, and then you end up with a food product that essentially has many of the important food technology capacities that we need to make a food. So the key ingredient, the key issue in any market uptake is finding ways to integrate these ingredients into attractive food products. And then there's cultured meat, which you're hearing about a little bit. But essentially the process is you remove muscle cells, you take the stem cells, you put it in tissue culture, you add some calf serum. So you need growth factors, you need hormones, but you basically need calf serum. You grow this, and you just grow it in massive amounts, and then you can produce a burger. Now, some people think that lab-grown meat could beat plant-based meats, and cultured meat could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 75 to 90%, essentially. And they see this vast market. Well, there's a lot to be overcome to be able to do that. I did tissue culture of liver cells for many years in basic research, and the bottom line is that it's always getting contaminated. You're growing these in large chambers. It's very hard to control. You're adding antibiotics to essentially kill off the bacteria that inevitably get in there, even when you grow it in a laminar flow hood. And you're still using fetal calf serum. So it really is not a vegetarian product. Well, and of course, because it's meat, it's not. Okay, what's the holy grail? Well, burgers are fine and easy because the meat is all just aggregated, and you can get it to stick together with xanthan gum or cornstarch or egg or whatever. But a beef steak is the holy grail of plant-based meat, and that's off, but people are imagining that they're going to be printing, 3D printing a steak, and so that's, I think, a while off as well. But let's turn to insects, something that I've had some interest in and was involved in a startup. Insects are the ultimate waste recycler, and it solves problems for man and manure. It's always bothered me that the same root is there for man and manure. I sort of have problems getting past that, but that's the truth. They actually come from different roots, but man is in there. Okay, so we can start out with food waste. As you know, about 40% of the food in Western countries ends up being wasted. You know, as we go to the farmer's market, which are all over the place now, we buy that head of collards. We decide we really don't want to eat that much damn collards. and we let it sit there and it ultimately goes bad and we throw it in the trash. Or we have all these other things. We go to the supermarket hungry, we come home with this, that, put it in the refrigerator, and before we know it, it's gone bad. So we waste a lot of food. And of course, if it's pockmarked in any way, the supermarkets throw it out. So what happens with food right now is that goes into the landfill, generates by anaerobic fermentation a lot of greenhouse gases, including methane, and goes off into the atmosphere. Some of it we use for energy production. Better to feed insects that food waste, and then you grow them as larvae, not the adult fly form. You grow it as a larvae. In 10 days, it increases tenfold in size and obviously protein content. We harvest the protein and the lipid. We feed that to animals, pigs, chicken, fish, etc. And the remainder that's left, which is really the insect stool, which we call frass, is used as a fertilizer. So insects are the ultimate recycler. That comes back into what we use in the field, or we've fed our livestock with that. So it solves the problem of manure. If you compare the caterpillar to the cow on all of these, for edible food product and health value, ecological impact, feed efficiency and yield of edible product, or reproduction rate and population expansion, I don't have the time to go through any of those details. The overall winner on each round of this fight is the insect. So the one we've been interested in is the black soldier fly, which is very different than the house fly. It doesn't land on people, doesn't land on your food. Essentially, the adult is a non-biting organism that only lives for a couple of days, and its goal is to reproduce. But manure, of course, has odor and pathogens in a large volume when you realize the amount of livestock we produce in the U.S. You can introduce the larvae, the black soldier fly larvae, to the manure. They'll grow, as I just told you, tenfold in 10 days. You harvest them. You can use them as fish feed. Right now, much of the fish feed has gotten to be very expensive because that's all the anchovies and small fish out of the ocean. So you cut down on the amount of forage fish used for fish meal, and that lowers the cost of fish feed and fish, and that could also produce, there's a global demand for fish consumption and better health, could reduce food insecurity. So essentially the black soldier fly upgrades a low value product like manure and food waste into high value animal protein and oil for diets of fish, pigs, chickens, and it increases the sustainability of fish and pig production. Let's look at the emission intensities of these various foods. You can see beef at the top. Cultured beef is also very high. Corn is high. Chicken is there. But when you get down to the bottom of wheat, nuts, insects, beans, peas, tofu, you're talking about very low emissions. So switching from beef to alternative proteins, and these are good quality proteins, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, especially for transitions to plant or insect-based alternatives. So what are some of the fears and phobias of eating novel foods like insects? Well, one is food safety, so I have a little quiz for you. The red meat we put in our stomachs is enough to have killed most of us sitting here, and certainly the person standing here. Red meat, some people say is poison. Chinese food is loaded with monosodium glutamate. High saturated fats can be disastrous. And none of us realize the long-term harm caused by toxins in our drinking water. However, there's one food that is the most dangerous of all and causes the most grief and suffering for years after eating it. So one food. So what is it? Volunteers, what is that one food? You just eat it one time, and it can cause grief and suffering the rest of your life. No takers? Wedding cake. I'm married 52 years, so it hasn't killed me yet. Okay, Changing meat consumption is a challenge. The way forward in the crazed maze of the cerebrum there's a way we have a way to go. So one little kid says, I'll have a hamburger. And so the mom says, what's the one little word you've forgotten? So the other kid pipes up, chips. So it's not please, but chips. Okay, why do we eat what we eat? So real quickly, this could be, I've given this whole talk in this course on that over a number of years. It's more reflexive than rational. We're not going back to that table back there and sort of looking for a nutritional label and deciding whether we're going to have the muffin or the little jelly donut or whatever. You come in, you're hungry, we stack you with all this pastry before you even get to the fruit. So you filled your plate up with the pastries and then you sit down. It wasn't rational what you were doing. You didn't think about it. Even the most prominent nutritionist isn't thinking about it. They just said, damn, I'm hungry. And I skipped out of the house to beat the 280 traffic or whatever. And so I'm going to eat one of those jelly donuts. So it's taste, it's hedonic. It's taste, smell, texture, mouthfeel, and juicy. It's logistics. What's the cost? What's the convenience and the availability? That's available. Emotions. Dr. King made the point very nicely. Eating, as I said initially, is an emotional experience. There's treat and reward. We eat for comfort. We eat for familiarity. And then we do some virtue signaling. We want to show off that we're doing the right thing. So we go with our friends to Burger King and we eat that Impossible Whopper. And we sort of pat ourselves on the shoulders and puff up our chest, etc., and feel real good. So that's virtue signaling. We're showing off how concerned we are about health, the environment, and animal welfare. Safety and trust, we just reviewed that. Inspirational, it's values. It's culture, religion, sustainability, and health. We're eating what we are used to in our culture. We find it offensive to think about eating dogs. People eat dogs. We don't eat snakes, typically. We don't eat insects. But throughout the Far East, they eat enormous numbers of insects. And then it's aspirational. There's sort of the marketing of the health halo. This food is healthy. That term means nothing when you read about it. Or natural. That term means even less. There's greenwashing. That is, this product will make you feel good about eating it. It's less environmental impact. So maybe that's why we have the green brains here. And then there's power. We all want to appear powerful and we're concerned about our appearance. So it's aspiration. So there are two sides to changing behavior. There's behavior mod and there's sort of the public health side. Behavior mod is what a lot of us have done for many years. That is, getting people to have more knowledge about foods, increasing their skills, being able to read labels, their ability to prepare food in healthy ways, and then cultural changes. But really, when in your health and what you're doing is you're pushing a burden uphill. In public health, our job is to lower the height of that fulcrum, to make it easier for more people to do the right thing. So that's making the healthy foods affordable, making unhealthy foods less affordable, making them accessible to people, advertising, policy, and legislation. Those are the big change variables. Now, some of you appreciate calorie displacement. We're going to eat 2,000 calories a day or whatever you eat. We keep our weight relatively constant over many years. How do we do that? Well, it means that if we eat A for 250 calories, it means we don't eat B for 250 calories. We just don't add the 250 calories or subtract the 250 calories. So that's calorie displacement. And many of you have calculated that even if we were off by 100 calories a day, we would gain 10 pounds in a year. So, we're really very tightly controlled. So due to time, so there is this displacement. Due to time demands, highly processed, fast, convenient foods, lacking key nutrients. So if we go eat regular fast food, that's going to displace healthy foods. Context counts. I think the first law of nutrition to me is if it comes into the house, it's going to be eaten. Now, I've just told you that the kale that came in wasn't, or the collards wasn't eaten. But most of the time, if you have the snacks in your house, I don't think snack foods get thrown out. Has anybody thrown out any snack foods in their house recently? Candy bars, whatever? No. They get eaten. So it's in sight, onto the plate, into the mouth. Fast foods and French fries. I think the reason my parents named me Frank Franklin was probably they were thinking about fast foods and French fries at that time. Comfort foods, stress. Everybody experiences stress. Some people experience distress. But in everybody's life, there's chaos, there's crisis, there are time crushes, there are crashes, there's confusion. And it used to be the fight or flight response. Well, we don't really have the fight or flight response right now, but food becomes our comfort. So some of you remember the original Saturday Night Live, Gilda Radner, the great comedian who sadly died of ovarian cancer young. And she used to play Rosanna, and she would say, well, it just goes to show you, it's always something. If it ain't one thing, it's another. And here this guy has junk food for thought. So, are there reasons to be optimistic? Yes, we've had changes in a positive way in a number of issues. Tobacco has gone way down. HIV has been controlled. Trans fatty acids, as soon as we threatened to label it, and we did label it, the manufacturers reduced its use. The same is going on with Chile, where Nestle and Coke and they've reformatted their products because they have to label it as high in sugar. They put a black stop sign on it about how high it is in sugar. So a full range, though, of policy levers are necessary. There's soft policy interventions, consumer advice, information, education, and food labeling. That can help. In my view, we need hard policy interventions. We need laws, we need fiscal measures, we need subsidies and penalties. That is, we subsidize the healthier products by 25% or more, and we penalize the unhealthier products by 25% or more. And we do that in programs from SNAP all the way out. Trade reconfiguration, we have joint public-private investment and incentives and disincentives all along the food changes. So major changes to our diet beyond burgers are required for a healthy population and the planet starting now. So every story has to have a moral. So the question is, what's the moral of this? So a hungry lion came upon a herd of cattle. He chased and caught the bull. He ate till full and let out with a great roar. A nearby hunter heard the lion and shot him. So what's the moral of the story? And I even have a decent-sized greenback here for a person who can tell me what the answer to that is. So what's the moral of the story? Anybody, any suggestions? None? All right. Be like that. When you are full of bull, you should keep your mouth shut. So the idea is, in the BS meter that you've probably used today, we've gone past the put on the boots, put on the life vest to man the lifeboats on the BS meter. So I'm not a pedophile, I'm a pediatrician, pediatric gastroenterologist. So we'll take any questions. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I've read before that like sustainably raised beef and like grass-fed beef and stuff can actually be good for the environment. Is that true?
I don't think it is necessarily, because a lot of them still go to slaughter and go into feedlots. And so I think, and then you're still, there's only so much grass they can consume. Now, of course, cows can live on grass, whereas we can't because of the fermentation chamber they have in their stomach. It's a little bit healthier, but not much more. Yes, ma'am.
What are your personal practices regarding like eating meat and things like that? One
of the dangers of giving this kind of talk all I can say is after promoting fruits and vegetables pretty actively, I started eating a hell of a lot more fruits and vegetables. So I have cut back on beef quite a bit. So we use smaller amounts of beef, eat a lot of fish, and eat more legumes. And that's nothing terribly new for me. I've eaten a lot of legumes. Used to eat hummus sandwiches every day for lunch when I was working at UAB, etc. So I think it's fairly easy to make gradual changes in your meat intake. And it depends on your spouse or your significant other or whatever. And so I would say that we're getting a bit of a dysfunctional marriage from an eating point of view, where my wife still likes beef. And so we're sometimes preparing two different meals, or adjusting the meal around that, or going out and choosing different items. But yeah, I think when you start thinking about it, you make these gradual changes. And a year from now, 2 years from now, you're going to be eating healthier than you are right now. And it's easy to do that. I mean, you start looking at, rather than having meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you're sort of looking at maybe meat for dinner in smaller portions. They always tell you in nutrition, look at the, 4-ounce portion is the size of your fist, the palm of your hand. Well, those, when you go to Longhorn Steakhouse or whatever, you're getting this much meat. And lots of times we're finishing everything. So yeah, I think thinking about nutrition ends up, polluting your eating pattern. That's been a problem. I mean, when I got a PhD in nutrition, it sort of spoiled my eating altogether. I hate to admit that, but yeah, I used to enjoy eating more than I did when I didn't know anything about it. But now that I'm learning a lot more about it, it sort of says you don't eat this or that. Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about plant-based diets for pediatric patients?
Very good question. I think very young children, of course, should be fed breast milk through the first year or two of life. And that's a good source of protein, of course, and it's also only has about 8 to 10% of its calories from protein, and yet kids are growing perfectly well. I think the challenge with children is the fact that a plant-based diet can be very low in energy. If you really were on an old macrobiotic, pure vegan diet, not using a lot of oil, kids didn't have the capacity, and many years ago they showed that children would not grow as well in some of these macrobiotic diets. I think that's true. Children have small gastric capacity, they need energy density. And around the world, the big challenge is, of course, they eat a gruel of cassava or something which is a poor quality protein, a lot of water that's dirty, and they get diarrhea, and the infection malnutrition cycle occurs. And so I think it is a challenge, but I think if you add enough oil to it, and you keep some decent protein in there, a kid will grow just perfectly fine. And so that's particularly true after you get past 18 to 24 months of age. So I think plant-based diets are fine. And a lot of vegans and vegetarian children have done just beautifully. Other questions? Yes?
Dr. Franklin, a lot of our special needs parents are getting the message and from some medical institutions about no dairy, which they then prescribe no dairy for their growing children. Would you comment on that?
Well, other than the fact that so many people who are prescribing diets don't know so little about nutrition, that's sort of another statement. I think there is value to dairy. I think that, yes, you can get your calcium some other way. Yes, you can get your vitamin D some other way. But milk still works perfectly fine. I don't think that, milk is the be-all and end-all of bones necessarily. And we can get excess protein and leach calcium out. But I think it's a great source. And I'm less worried about saturated fat in those younger age groups. I think, whole milk is a good source. You can get by with 1 or 2% milk. It's a little bit more challenging with skim milk. And I think it's really important to get your vitamin D. And that's an easy source of vitamin D and a good source of calcium. And I don't think there's any reason to restrict dairy. Everybody talks about lactose intolerance, but lactose intolerance is there, but it's a problem among teenagers and older where you lose the lactase. And that's if you're from anywhere else in the world other than Scandinavia, you lose that lactase enzyme. But there's still, even for adults, lactate milk or soy milk. And I think that, for some reason, it's just fascinating to me that almond milk has replaced soy milk in the supermarket. And soy milk is a perfectly good thing. It's got a good fat in it. It's vitamin D fortified. They add calcium to it as well. It's a plant-based product. So what do? They produce a milk that has almost no protein, is all sugar and fat. And they call it almond milk, which it is. But I don't picture people squeezing an almond, getting out early in the morning and going out to the almond field and milking the almonds. But it's gotten to be very popular. And so it's really displacing soy in the supermarket, which I think is sort of sad as well. Other questions? We're running short. Yes?
So whenever you have clients that you think they would really benefit from decreasing the meat intake, and you start with like a gradual reduction process, what are some different ways that you encourage them to engage in that? Because I know, there's some patients that are just like, oh my gosh, I could never, ever like go a day without meat. So how do you encourage them to go through that?
I send them to the dietitian. No. No. I think small changes, because you can find out what the person eats for breakfast. I mean, the first hallmark of any nutrient modification program is not to start out in your whole spiel, but to find out what the person's eating, and then to slowly make those changes. So if they're eating bacon for breakfast, you suggest that they leave that off, but they still enjoy their egg biscuit. A person won't even notice. Most of the time, if you think about what you're eating, what are you eating bacon for? You're eating bacon for the salt and this sort of smoky flavor. You can reproduce that a lot of different ways. The same goes with lunch. They can just eat, a small amount of chicken or throw some tofu on their salad, eating a smaller steak at dinner time. So I think it depends on what the person's eating, but you can essentially make a nutrient modification without driving them crazy. But ultimately, it has to be about flavor, it has to be about enjoyment. That's why we're eating foods. The last thing you want to do is convert somebody into a nutrition nut. And people can eat healthy without becoming nutritionists. They can eat healthy without becoming a nut about it. All right, let's break at this time. Thank you very much.